Okay, here we are today. I'm honored to be here today with Susan Eisenhower. I'm grateful for the chance to speak with Susan today on behalf of the Ohio Business Roundtable about an important book she wrote on the strategic leadership of her grandfather, how Ike led. Welcome, Susan.
Well,
great
thank you, Nick. It's great to be here.
Oh, absolutely. I know you went through in the book some of the relationships that existed there, and I was struck by the George Patton relationship, because the book talked about, he had team members. He never was personal with the team members. He tried to keep his distance from that perspective. But every CEO has their George Patton, and I just curious as to what you thought about that part of it, because you brought that out in the book.
Yeah, well, it's actually George Patton was a brilliant tank commander. But really high maintenance, really high maintenance. He had...
We've all had that situation.
Yeah, Ike wrote Mamie once and said, George Patton never loses an opportunity to keep his mouth shut. And, and so, he was a rolling PR disaster, including his visit to a hospital at a crucial time in the war, and, dressed down people with PTSD for... failure to rise to the occasion. I mean, he was doing a range of things like that. But Patton wasn't his only problem. Yeah. He had his British military subordinate wanted his job, and made it clear every day of the week that he could do a better job than his boss. That was another problem. But Eisenhower understood in that case that Montgomery, this is Field Marshal Montgomery, was a necessary player too, because of what he meant to the British and what he meant to British morale. And so you have all of these characters and a lot to manage, and Eisenhower's bosses, which would be like the board of directors, I guess, couldn't agree among themselves what the right strategy was. So he had conflicts both above him and below him. And it was his job to manage these personalities and to bring about what I call unity of purpose.
Yep. But those relationships were key.
Yeah.
And actually, as president, the polls showed, I mean, in his election cycle, actually, first time I think it was 60%, second time was a landslide at over 80%.
Right.
It just showed the ability for him to reach across the aisle, but also reach every American.
Right. But you know what the thing was about the Americans is so many had served under him during the war, and they trusted him. As we've discussed many times in the course of interviews on this book, is that he went out and met as many GIs as he could, and many of them remembered, and certainly many of them, all of them talked about the fact that he was out making these visits. So what that really does is foster trust.
Yeah.
And honestly, Nick, I think at the end of the day, trust is at the core of successful leadership. You can't get people to go into combat with you and to risk their lives if they don't trust the person who's issuing the orders. And so I think in that respect, there's so many things that go into building trust, but at the heart of it is the relationship you build with people you are engaged with.
And I think that's probably one of his hugest benefits from an election cycle, was that people did trust him, but they also absolutely knew his character.
Right. Well, few people remember that in 1956, as he's running for re-election, we're in the middle of what's called the Suez Crisis. And this is a fascinating story where three of America's longtime allies were working behind the scenes without the United States' knowledge to overthrow President Nasser in Egypt over ownership of the Suez Canal. And Eisenhower had a very specific principle for that, which I think resonates still today. He believed that if the international community, or any country within the international community, had one rule for itself and its allies and one rule for everyone else, there would never be peace. Yeah. And peace, of course, was his largest objective. So if you think about that, going right into the election, he took on the British, the French, and the Israeli governments, all of them very closely tied to his own political base. And when we got up to the moment of the election, he was still playing hardball with our allies on election day.
Yeah.
And he said to my father, and he confirmed this in writing to one of his childhood friends, he said, well, if I lose the election, so be it. But we're not going to back down over Suez.
Mm-hmm.
And well, it turns out the American people trusted him,
Yep.
that he would resolve that issue, and he won in a landslide even larger than than the one in 1952.
And even from an ethical standard, he, with natural gas legislation, I believe, he pulled his support for that based on the way it was done. There was some, I think, some vote buying going on or something.
Yeah, there was vote buying going. I have to tell you, this is one of my favorite parts of the book, when I discovered that he vetoed a piece of legislation he agreed with,
Right.
because he didn't like the way it was lobbied. Yeah, the important objective there is that, and you see it time and time about the way he handled certain issues, is that he wanted to elevate the reputation of our government in the eyes of the American people. He wanted the government to have credibility and respect in their eyes, and there had been enough publicity about this particular situation that he thought if he signed the bill, and everyone knowing that, of course, he was part of those who supported this measure, that it would look like everybody was in on things. And no, it wasn't going to be that way, but it seemed like a little relic of the past, that particular story.
Yeah, right. You brought up the British commander that was responsible for the paratroopers. I was really struck by his decision process, because he was taking input from all different areas at the time.
Right.
And he asked this British general to write a letter to him with his recommendation, because he wanted to make sure that this general had air cover, that General Eisenhower was making the decision, and he was going to take responsibility for it. And I think that says a lot about a leader, in terms of he was always, he certainly seemed to give credit to everyone that should get credit, and he was perfectly fine for them getting that credit, but at the same time he provided air cover, and he took responsibility.
Well, you know, during the war, generals were being fired on a fairly regular basis for, you know, for the outcome of their decisions. And I'm talking about some of his subordinates. And the reason for that is, when lives are at stake here, you can't have someone who does not demonstrate clear judgment. Yeah. And Eisenhower was afraid that the person who brought him a very serious recommendation would be held responsible if it were a fiasco. He wanted to take the full responsibility. As it turns out, the numbers were a tiny fraction of what was predicted. But part of Eisenhower's thought process was to go through the entire plan and the reasoning behind the plan. And he decided that the linchpin of the entire operation were those paratroopers. But it was still a tough decision.
He was always thinking about what he characterized as the long poles versus the short poles. Right. And that the long poles had to be stabilized and firm for the short poles to work. And I just, you see that from a CEO perspective, where, you know, we're having to focus on the long-term issues associated with our companies in the context of quarterly earnings calls and things like that. So it's such a huge parallel that exists there.
Well, that's right. The short poles need attention too, because sometimes they can make the tent flap so much that it destabilizes the long poles. But so this is the nature of strategic leadership, which I think is largely unappreciated by people who are only responsible for holding up short poles, or who are only there for the maintenance of one of the three long poles. You see what I mean? A person at the top has so many considerations.
This was a quote of his, and it really comes to current times, and I'm sort of fast forwarding when he was president, but some of the thought processes along the way. The aggressive demands of various groups and special interests, callous or selfish or even well-intentioned, contradicted that American tradition that no part of our country should prosper except as the whole of America prospered. Unless there were changes, I felt like eventually only the promises of the extreme right and the extreme left would be heard in public places. I think that's really prophetic based upon what's happening today.
That's right. You know, he gave that speech in 1949.
It's amazing.
I know. Well,
Just
again,
amazing.
we were living in tumultuous times, and first of all, a lot of people thought that we could go back, that after the war was over, we could go back to the way we were before the war. And he understood that that just wasn't going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
We had the advent of nuclear weapons, the atomic weapon first, and then the hydrogen bomb. That changed the nature of warfare. And technological change was moving at such a pace that nobody was going to ever be able to reinvent what we had before, to the extent that you even wanted to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that I think one of his underestimated but most important legacies is that he took a political system that was deeply divided about America's place in the world after the war.
Yep.
The Republicans were largely isolationist, and the Democrats were certainly engaged internationally in their perspective. But he took his own party and took it from being an isolationist party to one fully committed to the international community, and that was no small job.
Mm-hmm. You know, you seem to always apply those lessons of war as well. Mm-hmm. in the Korean conflict, Hungary, all those things that were occurring at that point in time, and really he understood the issues and the damage associated with war, and it was to be avoided at all costs. And I think that was something that only he could really bring out at the right time for the country. And I don't think he gets enough credit for keeping us out of substantial conflicts that were occurring at the time, even with the Russians and so forth. And the other thing too is I thought it was really interesting that even the German experience, he understood that experience, and when it came to the racial strife that occurred, he pointed out that if you have socioeconomic differences, that's really ripe for unrest to occur in the nation. So I'm just.
I am so. You just nailed it. You nailed it. His experience during World War II and seeing what a Western country could do to itself in the world, and to see how they went about it. He was changed forever by going to Ohrdruf, which was one of the sub-camps of Buchenwald. It was a forced labor camp, and then it turned into a death camp. And he went over, and the decisions he had to make, he said, we can just never have a war of this scale or again. So you're completely correct. The way he looks at his economic policy and everything else is about assuring that moderation will drive the policy decisions of this country, because he recognized that people who are well-meaning, who might even think that they are God-fearing, can be changed utterly by humiliation, desperation, poverty, hopelessness. And he understood that if we couldn't lift all of them up together, that the extremists could introduce all kinds of toxic ideas that could turn into something terrible again. And he was determined that it would never happen. Now, let me just say one other thing on the military side. You know, he was a trained military man and reached the top during the war. But I have had several scholars tell me that he understood that nuclear weapons had changed everything a lot faster than many in his profession. So let me just say the other thing I really took away from this book was, wow, I mean, how he tried to make his own profession straighten up and fly right.
Oh, that's right.
And that couldn't have been easy. He was their hero after the war, but he had to tell them, a phrase we used to use in our family, the facts of life. And they didn't like it.
Yeah. I think it all comes down to his philosophy of the middle way, and the fact that he brought people together in so many ways, and actually it was reflected in the polls.
Yes.
In the presidential election. I think it was 60%, then 80% the second time around. So just amazing across the aisle work, and the things that you mentioned in the book that he was doing, where he had actually family members of congressmen, had regular lunches with congressmen to learn about them. That doesn't happen today.
Well, he also believed in, first of all, accountability. This is the big thing. I had a couple of interesting experiences with him that only underscored for me that the way to retain that big, wonderful smile that he would flash all the time would be to take full and utter responsibility for every little minor upset, immediately, and then that made things calmer. But you know, he felt that people had to be responsible and accountable for everything, which prompts him to do a number of things that have not been done since, really. That's weekly cabinet meetings, weekly formal press briefings, weekly meetings with members of Congress from both parties, and then weekly members with the leadership itself. Yeah. Now, for 6 of those 8 years, the Democrats were in control of Congress. So the Friday night get together for a drink at the White House with Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn was a big part of this relationship that he built that made it possible to make winners out of everybody. And it took a lot of time, of course. He also had he chaired the National Security Council, which met once a week. And everybody who came to those meetings was expected to be conversant in all of the issues. Even if you were the Secretary of Transportation, you'd be expected to speak up on national security policy.
And they valued that. I mean,
they valued that.
Yeah.
And then he would listen to these divergent viewpoints and then go into a quiet room, make a decision. But here's the key. He had an enforcer whose responsibility it was to follow up with everybody who was in the meeting and make sure that everybody who heard what the decision was, that they went ahead and implemented it.
Yep.
So mattress mice, as we call them in Washington, you know, the bureaucracy that eats away at, you know, important decisions. Mattress mice were trapped. Yeah.